Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Mr. West, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm gonna learn a little bit at least. I'm very interested in a lot of the work that you've done. Could you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, my name is Nigel West. I've been writing, studying, been involved in the intelligence community for about 40 years. I've spent 10 years at the Counterintelligence Center in Washington, D.C. My interest really is in documenting operations that were conducted during the Second World War and Cold War that I can shed new light on by reading declassified files. So that's my speciality, and my last couple of dozen books have been based on material that wasn't hitherto available. You could call it revisionism, but it's just simply taking new information and reinterpreting old events.
Yeah, I learned a lot about that doing the Kennedy assassination topic, looking through a lot of the 2021 documents, looking through the 2017 release. And it's like, a lot of statements were made obviously in the beginning, and then we know new information now. And it's like, for me, I think I became very interested in just looking through all these documents. I mean, I don't know what it is about government documents that just is interesting for me to be able to look at, but I'm sure you get that. But when it comes to intelligence operations, what are some new things that you're able to shed light on?
Well, the really important thing to understand about looking at these government documents is that, first of all, these agencies on both sides of the Atlantic did not come up with the idea of, oh, we're a secret organization, let's publish our secrets. So the first thing you've got to understand about the documents when you look at them is that the agencies were usually dragged kicking and screaming into disclosure. So the word declassification just simply didn't exist. So the process is entirely new. The second thing that makes it so important historically is that the people who drew up these documents, the people who wrote the memoranda, wrote the letters, compiled the reports, had no expectation that they would ever be made public. So when you're talking about some of the very famous figures in counter-espionage like Guy Little, or in the Kennedy assassination, CIA reports, the people who wrote those reports were writing to a colleague or writing to subordinates or to their superiors. They had no concept that these would be studied and picked over by historians 50 years later. And that is what makes them so fascinating and so authentic, is that this is the genuine article. They weren't writing for the file, they were writing privately to colleagues. And that's makes the document so terribly important and so authentic.
What do you deal with? Like, do you ever get any criticisms? Like, whenever I bring up it's probably we don't have that document because maybe they destroyed it, people go, oh, that's just what you can say, so you don't have to show your evidence. I'm like, well, it's real though. Like, they destroyed documents. I mean, we're lucky for the things that we do have and the things that we do get classified.
Well, there are good reasons for keeping documents classified. And even in today's world, there is a need to protect sources and methods. So imagine for a moment that you're a case officer. Your responsibility is to recruit agents. One of the things that you need to be able to say to your potential agent is, I promise you, your involvement, your participation, your contribution will never be disclosed. Even in 100 years' time, we will protect your true identity. We will only refer to you in the files, by a code name, and not even you are going to know what your own code name is. So that's a very effective promise to make to people when they're offering information in today's world about something like a terrorist incident or operation or planned atrocity in the future. To make that promise and to be able to keep that promise is very important. So it's not an entirely futile exercise, the concept of secret operations and keeping secrets and protecting the identities of sources and methods. If you have developed a particular skill, you've got a methodology of extracting information, let's say gleaning it from the internet through one of the programs that were compromised by Ed Snowden, you can see that once an adversary has discovered the process that you're using, the method that you've adopted, it becomes worthless. In fact, it becomes a potential weapon to be used against you. So there are good reasons for protecting sources and methods, and that's why we have classification.
Especially, I would guess around the time of the Cold War, especially when we had a lot of espionage going on, people stealing other people's documents and
No, there's
information.
been no change. You might think that there was more espionage going on during the Second World War or the Cold War. No. The personalities change, the technology changes, but the amount of intelligence collection going on around the world escalates rather than diminishes. And let me remind you, in the Clinton administration, immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, people were going around talking about the so-called peace dividend. Why do we need a CIA? Daniel Patrick Moynihan got up in Congress and actually proposed the abolition of the CIA because it had done its job. And here we are, post 9/11, trying to deal with global terrorism. So you can see that there is a greater need than ever to maintain vigilance and to have agencies and individuals who've dedicated their life to collecting clandestine information.
Well, that's people usually get mad. Like I know Kennedy was one of the people that wanted to abolish the Central Intelligence Agency and scatter into dust into the wind. But it's every government that's spying on each other, especially even when there's a war. If there's not a war that's we're able to see and we're able to see on the television, there's always some type of intelligence war, always a way to try and find a way to, I guess, be better than your enemies.
Of course, the essence of intelligence is trying to look over the hill to see what your adversary is up to. That if there is a defector offering information, valuable information, you need to have the means and the organization to be able to handle that information, to handle the agent himself or herself, to resettle a defector, and to distribute the information in a timely fashion to policymakers so that they can take advantage of the information that you're supplying them with. So you're right. Virtually every country in the world has an internal security agency like the FBI, has an external intelligence collection agency like the CIA, and maybe an eavesdropping organization if they're really sophisticated like NSA.
Now, you mentioned that the methods, I guess the executive action of the way that these things are done have changed, like the technology has changed, but it's always kind of been here. How far back did you go, and how are you able to trace it from when you started to where it's at now?
Well, I think that intelligence collection is as old as the Bible. There have been people sent into foreign lands to spy out an adversary. We've seen it documented by Chinese scholars 1,000 years ago. We see it in the Bible. If somebody comes to you and says, I have information that it could be of value to you, to your policymakers, how are you going to handle that? You need an intelligence professional to decide whether or not the information is authentic. You have to decide whether or not the person who is approaching you is genuine, or whether they're just coat trailing to identify intelligence personnel on the other side. You then have to be able to have analysts to look at the information and put it into a geopolitical context. And then you've got to have the reports writers who can create a document written in words of one syllable, so that policymakers can understand the impact and the significance of what they're being told. And then you've got to have the ability to be able to make an assessment about that information. Is it new? Is it genuine? How does it fit in with other material that we know from the same subject? Is this a breakthrough of some kind? So these are all the skills that can be found in the intelligence community, and they're essential, and that's why they're to be found in virtually every country in the world.
Did you get more out of intelligence reports, like official reports from like a person to their agency, or did you get more, I guess, information out of like a personal letter or a personal diary? I know there are some names that get mentioned during all the Kennedy files, like individuals that just they were having personal back and forths. And to me, those are like the most crucial documents that we have, just because you get like a different side of like what you're officially told, not like any conspiracy stuff. It's just like you're getting a more like you get to know the person a little bit more on a deeper kind of level, like a more like sending a text. Like if me and you had a text conversation, people read our text, they can get the conversation, but they also get like I guess our attitudes and our personalities as well too.
You certainly get all of that from documentation. You don't just have to meet the individuals concerned, but how certain are you that the documents you've read are authentic? Let
It's
me
the
give you an
crazy part.
example.
It's the crazy part is there's so much where people are like, that's a fake document. I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah, well, I had a co-author for two of my books who was a KGB officer, delightful man, and he told me that when the KGB had got nothing else better to do, they forged Kennedy assassination documents. They would try to fake documents that would link particular CIA officers to some kind of a assassination conspiracy. They did that all the time. One particular CIA officer, a man called Dave Atlee Phillips, who was chief of operations for South America, found his face superimposed onto a photograph of somebody else and included in a fake CIA report. The KGB boasted that they reckoned that some of their forged documents appeared in about 300 books, English language books written about the Kennedy assassination. They embarrassed particular CIA officers they didn't like. They had a large number of CIA officers running around in circles trying to defend documents from people who weren't skilled, didn't have the knowledge to recognize these documents as fakes, and they're still in circulation to this day.
And that's just a common intelligence kind of tactic in a sense. Like we had regime change strategies for Cuba where it was like incentivizing or divisivizing the population to kind of stir up animosity in their own country. Just so
Yes, but that's very interesting that you say that, because that implies that there is an objective. Actually, curiously enough, amongst the Soviets, it was just sheer mischief making. They didn't have a grand strategy. It was just when they hadn't got anything else better to do, this is what they turned their hand to. So it wasn't a part of a monster plan to subvert the CIA. They just wanted to make a nuisance of themselves. And that's what they did. It's incomprehensible in a Western democracy that an intelligence agency or personnel within an organization could conduct themselves in such a way. But that was very much the Soviet style.
I think we have something similar like that today. It's called a Russian troll farm. There's fake pages on Facebook, and they're the top like Facebook pages, but they're all just bot accounts. They're were made in Russia. I think a lady snuck in. She was a journalist and went to this facility. It was like an office building, and there was no lights were on or anything. Just a bunch of computer systems, and they were all like fake accounts online. You're just like, what's real? Like it gets so difficult, but it's so like it's so strategic and it's so precise on so many actions where it does do the job effectively. So when it comes to just some of the operations that you came across through your research and some of the stuff you wrote about, could you give me like an operation that you, I guess, revisited and looked at and put a new perspective on?
Well, there have been so many, but I suppose if I've made any contribution to the history of intelligence, it's finding a spy double agent codenamed GARBO, who played a critical role in the Second World War. And he persuaded the Germans in 1944 that the invasion of Normandy was just a diversionary feint, and that the real invasion was going to take place across the English Channel to the Pas de Calais, far to the north of Normandy. And Garbo was a very remarkable double agent because he was the most trusted spy, with an enormous control of an enormous spy ring right across England. And he was reporting to the Nazis up to 3 hours a night. So he was an extremely active agent. He got 24 sub-agents, and he was being directed by the Germans, reporting on the order of battle within the UK, predicting events, making claims about observations, visiting particular sites, reporting on personnel that he had met or seen, talking about the shoulder flashes and the symbols on vehicles that he had spotted in particular locations. And of course, it wasn't until 1972 that we discovered that Garbo was the double agent. He was under the control of the British the entire time, and that his 24 sub-agents didn't exist at all. They were all in his head. Each of them had got their own particular personalities. They'd got their own jobs, girlfriend problems, money issues, travel problems, but they were fake. They just existed in Garbo's head. And in 1984, for the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings, I was able to find him in South America, bring him back to London, take him to Buckingham Palace, where he was invested with the medal that he'd been given in conditions of great secrecy in 1944. And he was able to tell his story for the first time. And what a remarkable man he was. So I think in retrospect, that was probably one of my more significant contributions. I remember going to Mobile, Alabama to meet an agent whose name was Helena Szymanska. She had been the wife of the Polish military attaché in Berlin before the war. She'd had an affair with Admiral Canaris, who was the chief of the German intelligence service. And what was remarkable was that she had been in an apartment paid for by Canaris in Switzerland all the way through the war, and he used to visit her and pass on information, knowing that she was an agent of the British. So she was working as a British agent, reporting on the information that was being imparted to her by Admiral Canaris. Well, again, an extraordinary story.
Was he self-sabotaging himself by giving her information? Like if he knew that she was a spy, was he self-sabotaging?
Yes.
Okay. So he wasn't planning
Yes.
fake information.
No, he knew that she was in touch with the British, and he supplied information, and very specifically, before the Barbarossa attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, he asked her to warn the British that the Germans intended to attack the Soviet Union.
I mean, the amount of paranoia that a lot of these intelligence agencies must be dealing with, at least a lot of the people involved in there. I mean, like, when did they start being able to root out if someone was a double agent or not?
Well, there's a difference between a double agent and a penetration agent. So if you're talking about people who worked within intelligence agencies, but were actively reporting to an adversary, that doesn't make them a double agent. That's a penetration agent. And of course, there were plenty of those during the Second World War in virtually every organization. And if you've got sufficient resources, or you've got the ability to call upon some kind of ideological resource, then you may benefit from getting that kind of penetration. So the Soviets have penetrated OSS, which was one of the American forerunners to the CIA, penetrated the CIA. The British were penetrated. There was the famous Cambridge Five, five spies educated at Cambridge University who subsequently went into government jobs. All five turned out to be senior moles, not double agents, moles. So the process of rooting out traitors within your own organization continues to this day. And of course, it's a great principle in counterintelligence that you should always assume current penetration, and you shouldn't be shocked when you discover penetration. You should be pleased, sort that out, eliminate the problem, and move on to the next investigation.
If I'm not mistaken, that was one of the issues with Guy Liddell as well too, or Little as well too. There was a person that was a KGB that was a protege or one of his people that he trained that ended up giving important information over, and he was so, I guess, hurt by that, or taken back by that he ended up retiring, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Guy Liddell had the misfortune to know personally 4 of the 5 Cambridge spies. And the person that you're referring to, who was his personal assistant, was Anthony Blunt. And Blunt had been a spy who'd been recruited in 1935 by Kim Philby. Liddell also knew and liked Kim Philby and Guy Burgess, and he was friendly with Donald Maclean's sister. Donald Maclean was one of the Cambridge Five. But the important thing to understand about the scale of betrayal and why people like Guy Liddell felt this so desperately personally was that in 1943, it was recommended by the Director General of the Security Service that the Prime Minister should be informed of exactly what MI5 did, its operations, its sources of information. And there was an element of competition for the Prime Minister's attention. And Guy Liddell appointed his assistant, Anthony Blunt, to write a monthly report, just a short report, for the Prime Minister, containing everything that MI5 was doing that particular month, the identities of double agents, that they were running their own penetrations into embassies in London, the most secret sources of information, operations that they were conducting, cryptographic breakthroughs, reading diplomatic ciphers. All of this material was compiled every month by Anthony Blunt, who used to go in. This was an organization, by the way, that was completely compartmented. So the convention was not to look over the shoulder of your colleague to see what they were working on. It was a need-to-know principle. And Anthony Blunt broke through all of that. He went into the most secret departments of MI5 and said, I need to know the identity of your agents. I need to know the methodology that you're using in this particular subsection. And he provided this information to Winston Churchill on a monthly basis, which was so secret, by the way, that Churchill wasn't allowed to keep a copy. Excuse me. He was only allowed to read the document in the presence of the Director General, and he then had to hand it back. That's how secret it was. But copies of all of those reports went to Moscow because Anthony Blunt was also a Soviet spy. So the level of personal betrayal for Guy Liddell, who had appointed him and trusted him and regarded him as a friend, was colossal, very hard to exaggerate.
Did you look into how he infiltrated and got in there to become involved with Guy Liddell?
Yes. Anthony Blunt was recommended by a friend of his, a mutual friend, who was an MI5 officer called Victor Rothschild, Lord Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family. And Victor Rothschild was by training a scientist, and he had joined MI5 in 1939 as a technical advisor. And his particular speciality was he developed a great skill in understanding the German construction of booby traps and explosive devices. So he was already a member of the security service. And when Anthony Blunt came back from France from Dunkirk in 1940, he was already a member of the intelligence corps because he spoke fluent French and had been engaged in censorship duties. And he wanted a more interesting job and asked Victor Rothschild whether he could get him into MI5. And Victor Rothschild asked Guy Little, who had no knowledge of Anthony Blunt at that stage, but was very impressed by what undoubtedly was an extraordinary intellect. And Anthony Blunt and Guy Little got on together, and Anthony Blunt became his eyes and ears within the security service and became his personal assistant, with the catastrophic consequences that you described.
Now, how deep was Guy involved in the intelligence agencies?
There was nothing that Guy Little didn't know. He was the continuous thread. He was the continuing institutional memory of virtually every espionage case from really about 1919. That's when he joined Scotland Yard as a clerk. He was an analyst, really, by profession. He never served in the field, although obviously he had been an artillery officer during the First World War. And he, like his two brothers, had all won military crosses for gallantry. But he had no personal experience of espionage, and in effect, he's taught himself at Scotland Yard. And when he realized that Scotland Yard itself had been penetrated by the Soviets in the 1920s, he opted to leave Scotland Yard and join MI5. So he joined MI5 in 1931, and he remained pretty much in charge of MI5's counter-espionage operations from 1931 all the way through to his retirement in 1954. I would say that during that period, 31 to 54, there was not a single counter-espionage file that wasn't opened without Guy Little's formal approval. You'll see his initials on virtually every single personal file of every investigation conducted from 1931 to 1954.
What do you think made him such a, important asset, I would say? Was it just that he was thorough?
And I think that Guy Little had a real talent for understanding human motivation. You've got to appreciate that spies aren't born, they develop, and they acquire their skills through motivation. What is it that makes somebody betray their country? Why would they give away secrets from another country? And it's by understanding that human psyche and having the interpersonal skills to develop the trust of an individual is so important. And Guy Little didn't really put a foot wrong from 1931 all the way through to 1954, apart from his unwise friendships and perhaps showing too much trust in some of his personal friends. He had a great skill of understanding human nature. And he was a great tactician. He had many other interests, by the way. He was a fascinating individual. He was a great musician. He was probably one of the top 3 amateur cellists in the UK. All the way through the war, he played at Southwark Cathedral, playing his cello. So he was a very remarkable man with many fields of achievement. But unfortunately, he did develop a friendship and a relationship with his personal assistant, Anthony Blunt, with Kim Philby, who was effectively his opposite number in MI6 or the Secret Intelligence Service. And with some reluctance, he actually employed Guy Burgess as an agent runner, Guy Burgess being one of the Cambridge Five and an accomplice with Blunt and Philby. So Guy Little was unwise in his friendships, but skilled as an intelligence officer.
Now, you've mentioned the Cambridge Five a couple of times. I'm not too familiar with what the Cambridge Five are, like who all the names are and what was their involvement and everything.
Well, the Cambridge Five all centered around Kim Philby. So Philby was a young man, privately educated in England. His father had been in the Indian civil service, and he went up to Cambridge, where he developed some strongly left-wing views. And after he left Cambridge, he went to Austria, where he fell in love with a communist called Lizzie Friedman. And he married Lizzie, brought her back to England, and she introduced him to a friend who introduced him to the KGB, or the NKVD at that time, illegal resident in London. And this particular man called Arnold Deutsch, was a very charismatic member of the Comintern, the Communist International. And he persuaded Philby that he was in an ideal position to fight fascism, and that if he could, although Philby was going to be a journalist and didn't have access to classified information, he knew plenty of people at Cambridge who were going to join the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office and go into government. And these were the people that the Soviets wanted to recruit. So Kim Philby acted as a talent spotter, making recommendations, went back to Cambridge University, not as a graduate student, but purely as an occasional visitor. And he was the person who recruited Guy Burgess, who would go on to work for MI5 and for the Secret Intelligence Service and for the BBC. And he in turn recruited Donald Maclean, who went to work in the Foreign Office. And he recommended the recruitment of John Cancross, who went to work in the Secret Intelligence Service. And those were the Cambridge Five. And not all of them knew about each other, but they were all educated at Cambridge. Not all of them were recruited at the same time, but the common denominator amongst them was Kim Philby. And so Kim Philby would survive the end of the Second World War, would survive the defection of Burgess and Maclean in 1951, and he wouldn't be caught until 1963, when he was persuaded to give a confession in return for an immunity from prosecution. And ultimately, he defected to the Soviet Union and then wrote his memoirs in 1968. So up until 1968, the British public really had very little understanding or knowledge of the Cambridge Five and the extent to which these highly intelligent, well-educated, well-positioned civil servants had betrayed their country.
Now, I've heard that a couple of times about spotters. Is this just a common spy tactic? I had someone on my show who investigated the CIA and the FBI involvement in some institutions. He wrote a book about it called Spy Schools. And it just had me like, that's very new to me. I never knew about universities and places of higher education that were being this, like, I guess, spotting ground for potential candidates for the agency or just potential spies in general. I mean, is this something that's just been going on for a long time?
Yes, for as long as there have been elite centers of education, there will be people who talent spot, either to gain the advantage of this particular resource for their own governments, or alternatively for a foreign power. And at the time in the mid-1930s, the coming collision between fascism and the Nazis, as opposed to the communists, manifested itself in the Spanish Civil War. And that was a great litmus test for people's political opinions. Few people understood where the Nazis would lead them. Nobody had any idea, of course, at that time of the Holocaust. But people were very concerned about the Nazis, and the only people who seemed to be opposing the Nazis were the communists. And so the Soviets drew on this natural resource, which was global in nature. There were people all over the world who were committed anti-fascists and saw this as an opportunity to recruit them to the Soviet cause. And therefore you found an extraordinary phenomenon. And that was in virtually every country in the world, there would be a Communist Party. And the Communist Party would pretend to be a legitimate political organization. But the reality is that it was controlled from Moscow, that its leadership would be decided by the Kremlin, and even the membership of the party would have to be vetted and approved by the NKVD. So essentially, the Kremlin had in virtually every country in the world a fifth column, if you like, a group of people who were committed to their own political ideals. And these were people who could be trained in clandestine operations and become spies. And a very large number of them in virtually every country in the world would conceal their true allegiances and burrow deep into the local administration in order to exercise influence on behalf of the Kremlin.
Did you, this is just maybe because I'm ignorant, I just don't know this one, but when it comes to the false defector program, and I'm just pulling this knowledge out of the stuff I've learned from Kennedy. I mean, Oswald allegedly defected to Russia and wanted to tear up his US citizenship, but they never cleared his US citizenship being torn up. And then when he came back, he was only interviewed for an hour by one FBI agent. And is that just a common tactic about a defector program or a false defector program? Is that something that was implemented later, more towards like 63, or was that something that had been around for a lot longer?
Well, defectors are very complicated individuals, and their motivation has to be understood. And not everybody has an intelligence value as a defector. So Lee Harvey Oswald, for instance, did defect to the Soviet Union, was interviewed at length by the Soviets. And you could, if by looking at his career, you can see what would have been of interest to them. He had been in the Marine Corps, and he had served as a radar operator at Atsugi, which was a Marine Corps base in Japan. It also happens to have been the same base when Lee Harvey Oswald was serving there, that the U-2 high altitude aerial reconnaissance aircraft was deployed. So Lee Harvey Oswald would have been of value if the Soviets had known the right questions to ask, and we can't be certain of that. You have a situation where Lee Harvey Oswald would have had good knowledge of the operational altitudes and the performance of the U-2 aircraft at a time when it was very secret and very few people, even within the CIA, knew about it. So Lee Harvey Oswald went to the Soviet Union, stayed there for a while, and then returned with a Russian wife, Marina. And we still don't know the full truth of those circumstances. He was obviously disaffected when he left the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, you can't say that he settled back very well in the United States. The fact that he was interviewed only once by the FBI upon his return doesn't seem strange to me at all, because he would have had very little intelligence value, very little to say the people who'd been interviewing him on the part of the KGB wouldn't have done so under their real name. They would have been operating under alias. So all he would have been able to say is, I went to Moscow, I lived in the Soviet Union for a certain amount of time, I worked in a radio factory and got fed up, and now I'm back in the United States. So there's nothing particularly odd about that.
They did surveil his mail for up to, I think it was 4 years. Then the week of the assassination, they dropped it the week before. Which, I mean, it only makes sense. I mean, you have a person. When he went to Russia, none of the people in Russia trust him. When he was interviewed by them, they thought he was a spy because his Russian was terrible, wasn't good. And I've seen those documents as well too. And it's just to me, it's just interesting because like I don't know the number of documents I've come across where it was just like average civilians that had CIA connections or were an FBI informant. And I was like, is this just a common like thing back then? Was that the CIA and the FBI were more open to reaching out to just average populations? Because I don't hear a single word about them today.
Well, when somebody volunteers information to the FBI or the CIA, depending upon the nature of that information and their own background, they could be putting their lives at risk. So if they're involved in organized crime or narcotics or a foreign terrorist organization, the FBI is under an obligation to protect the interests of that informant. So they will be very reluctant to make any disclosure or act on information in a way that compromises that source. So the same goes for the CIA. There will be a very large number of people who travel abroad. They won't necessarily be CIA agents. They may not be officers either, but they may have been to a particular village or been to a particular town or taken photographs of a particular bridge that might be of interest to the CIA. And there is an entire division called the Domestic Contacts Division within the CIA, and it's their responsibility. They have offices in most of the major cities in the United States, where more than 85% of CIA officers are based. And it's their job to go to citizens who've traveled to somewhere particularly interesting and debrief them. It doesn't make that source an agent, but of course, it is potentially compromising, and therefore they will maintain the confidentiality of that relationship.
Did you come across through any of your work when the British intelligence agency first, I guess, you started become more connected with the American intelligence agencies? Like you mentioned Churchill, but was there something before that? Was there communication, good back and forth connection between British? Because I feel like with British intelligence or just British history in general, they're very good at like there's not a whole lot of information when it comes to their intelligence agencies, at least that I would say that the general public knows about. It seems like there's more openness when it comes to, I guess, the US government. I mean, just on an aspect of the public knows more. I wouldn't say that they're willing to give that information over.
Well, I'd say two things about that. Firstly, there was no liaison relationship, formal relationship between British intelligence and their American counterparts prior to the Second World War. There was a good case in 1938 involving an American soldier that was discovered by the British, and this information was passed to the FBI. But what's quite amusing is that when you look at that particular case, it involved a soldier called Gunther Rumrich. And what's fascinating is that it is very clear from the file of that particular investigation that the British were looking at the American communication system and were very interested in particular key words that might have been used in American encrypted telegrams. In other words, the British, although cooperating and helping the Americans, were also trying to break their cipher systems and read their diplomatic traffic. So that, of course, came to an end in 1943 when there was a very considerable collaboration between the two countries, and that remains true to this day. There are British intelligence personnel based in American agencies. and vice versa. And there has been plenty of information disclosed about that relationship, which has expanded to include the other English-speaking countries of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Collectively, they're known as the Five Eyes. And this dates back to a collaboration in the cryptographic field in 1943, and then confirmed in the post-war era, where there was a great deal of liaison, which continues to this day. But it is also worth saying that that level of collaboration doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. You mentioned not much being known about British intelligence, but in the reality is, I would challenge you that there is a curious irony that if you think of a department within the British government called the Secret Intelligence Service, known as MI6, there have probably been more books written about that single department of government than any other ministry within the United Kingdom. So there is a paradox here of a secret organization, which for many years the fiction was maintained that it didn't exist in peacetime, it was only a wartime organization. That fiction collapsed, but there are thousands of books that have been written about MI6, very few about the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries.
I guess maybe because my point of view is like, for America, like we have like the Watergate scandal. William Colby, who I spoke with, a good friend of John Ranley, who wrote a lot of books about the CIA. He changed my perspective a lot about how you got to like not hate these institutions for doing this. You have to look at the justified reasons for doing them, which I do agree. There's a lot of justified reasons, but like, I mean, we know about now from the Watergate stuff. We know about MK Ultra. We know about just a lot of stuff where it's like, it's very hard, especially in today's time, someone sees that and sees that kind of thing. It's like, it's hard to justify, but I mean, it's not just one institution either. It's kind of like every institution. I think you have to
But
look.
don't forget that there was no CIA institutional involvement in Watergate.
That's the FBI. That's J. Edgar Hoover's administration.
Yes, but there was no involvement of them. The CIA refused to give the White House the cover that they asked for. After the burglary had taken place. It is true that some of the so-called plumbers, like Howard Hunt, had a background in the CIA, but that did not compromise or contaminate the CIA itself.
I meant more of a word like intelligence agencies, not just specifically CIA, but I was just talking about like intelligence agency scandals that we know about.
But these so-called scandals, when you look at them in detail, when you look at the Pike Committee report or the Church Committee report, these were investigations conducted to pursue these alleged scandals. For example, the assassination of foreign leaders. Turned out there weren't any. No, not a single one. Who was supposed to have been bumped off by the CIA? There never was anybody. So after all the years of the Pike and Church Committee hearings, the reality is that not one single person was ever indicted for any crime. So the proposition that intelligence agencies in the United States were behaving like a rogue elephant, as Frank Church said, turned out to be not only completely untrue, but people who write about this fail to acknowledge that Frank Church apologized to the CIA for calling them a rogue elephant, and acknowledging that everything that the CIA did was that was questionable, the so-called family jewels, had been authorized by the White House or by the Attorney General. And that didn't suit their agenda either.
Yeah, but even with the Bay of Pigs, like Alan Dulles, under the terms of plausible deniability that Kennedy didn't, I mean, it was Eisenhower's baby, but it became Kennedy's inherited problem. They
yes,
had,
but it wasn't the CIA's idea. The CIA didn't wake up one morning and Alan Dulles said, guess what, we're going to create a revolution in Cuba. This was established policy by the Eisenhower administration, and the CIA had been ordered to undertake this operation, which was then inherited by the Kennedy White House, and we know the results of that. But this was not a rogue operation conducted by self-motivated individuals within the organization without political approval either of Congress or of the Attorney General or the President himself.
Well, I mean, I would challenge that a little bit just because Kennedy's talk about wanting to scatter the Central Intelligence Agency to dust in the wind, basically into a million pieces and scatter it to the winds. I mean, if you look at Alan Dulles was a part of he head of MK Ultra that wasn't disclosed to the Warren Commission. Julian West, one of the main people that worked with Sidney Gottlieb, that was in charge with the MK Ultra program as well too, being Jack Ruby's psychiatrist. I mean, that wasn't disclosed to the Warren Commission, who was in charge of investigating the president.
Why should it have been? What possible connection?
The brainwashing tactics that he used during the Korean War to find out that there's more evidence to support that we did use biological weapons that were against the Geneva Convention over there. But we made the idea that they were brainwashed. These soldiers were that saying that we did, when really it was to unbrainwash them and make them forget.
Everything that was conducted, I'm not going to, in retrospect, try and justify MK Ultra.
I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking questions. Like I said, I'm coming across these documents, so I'm just wondering. That's what I meant by the scrutiny, I would say, against our intelligence agencies compared to the British intelligence agencies. It seemed like they have a lot of that stuff locked down, or maybe it's just the way that the civilian public in America views that type of stuff.
Well, all high-risk operations conducted by British intelligence organizations have a political sanction. So all of them are approved either by the Prime Minister or by the Foreign Secretary. And we also adopted an oversight committee, somewhat based on the American principle. But the reason why the CIA so welcomed congressional oversight was precisely in 1979 was precisely because of the CIA having to take the blame so often for political instructions, with the politicians then saying we had no idea this was going on. And so the oversight committees gave political cover to the CIA, and nobody in the CIA would contemplate running an operation behind the backs of Congress in today's world.
I wouldn't think in today's world, but I think William Colby was the one that exposed a lot of the horrible things that were going on with the Central Intelligence Agency, where he ended up leaving as director as well, too. I mean, if you look that up, it says that the CIA's reputation will never recover from this. And that's a quote from another director as well, too. I mean, I consider what he did good, mostly because like all the wiretapping and all that. I get it's needed as sometimes too, but also when you're in, like, you're doing those tactics for so long, like the CIA was never supposed to activate on domestic land, and we know from documents and all that that that's not true.
That's not strictly true. I mean, as I mentioned before, one of the largest divisions within the CIA is the domestic contacts division, and some of its most valuable intelligence reporting has come from there. And if the CIA is not allowed to operate in the United States, why are 85% of their staff based in the United States? And why do they have clandestine offices in all the major cities in the United States?
Well, it's like
I'm afraid it's a public myth that the CIA is not allowed to operate in the United States.
Well, I mean, even if you look at the documents for their interrogation methods, I mean, they can revive things from the old Rockefeller Commission only on covert operational persons, like people that were only doing actions overseas. There's none of it that says it's verified for anybody that was based in domestic. Anybody that's in overseas operations, they can use LSD interrogations. And I have a document to prove that they used it on a person named Alvarado, who claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald had paid $6,000 to a red-haired Negro to assassinate the president.
I'd be really careful about using any documents relating to the Kennedy assassination as evidence that the CIA used LSD operationally.
What about MK Ultra documents?
KGB loved forging them, loved forging them.
That's the hard part, is what is true. It gets so
Yeah.
dang difficult in all this.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, I mean, I know about the KGB stuff from Larry Hancock, who's viewed over 20,000 something of these documents. And I had him on my show to talk about UFOs in the first place. He goes, the hardest part about looking through the UFO documents is you don't know what's real. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, because they knew during the Cold War, a lot of this like UFO things, they thought they were Russian. They thought that's the first thing on any of one of these documents, but also there's like fake documents in there. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's showing me some of the fake documents. He goes, in case somebody broke in and scanned one of their documents, they'd run off with false information. I'm like, oh my God, like it's good if you know which one's real and which one's fake. But if you're like young eyes looking in and you're trying to scan through some of these documents, you think you got this document. It's like, oh my God, look at this. And it turns out to be wrong. I mean, that's Project Hero. What is it? Project Stargate. The whole movie, Men Who Stared Goats. We got a tip off from Russia from some agent that got false information saying they were creating psychological warriors. So we're like, let's start creating psychological warriors. And it's just like, I mean, it's fascinating to me. Like I said, I know probably my generation will be more quick to turn the pitchfork and be like, you need to tear up these institutions. I'm just looking at it like, I know every institution is doing something like this. It's not just America, it's every country. There's this whole spy game that I'm starting to realize about, and there's very good strategy in it all too, but it makes it very, very complicated. And I get the aspect of like secrecy and all this and like very little disclosure. And I mean, the number of documents that are destroyed makes it a little bit harder to put things in context as well too. But I just try and tackle it with kind of both perspectives a little bit, the fascination behind it, but also like what do we deem right as well too, and I understand it gets a little complicated, and obviously everybody has different personal political sides on that whole thing as well too. But damn, it's history, man. I mean, you start learning a lot of stuff like the whole UFO thing, the whole psychological warriors thing. I mean, that's an aspect of our history that we went down. I mean, it forged a whole movie in that aspect as well, too. And then Russia got news that we were creating psychological warriors from our news of that they were creating psychological warriors. And they're like, I guess we got to start creating psychological warriors. So it's like it fabricated real history, that false information, the importance of somebody writing down a document, whether they destroyed it or not, but somebody coming across that document literally paved a new way in history. It added an event. It created something that we necessarily wouldn't have even gone to if it wasn't because of that fake document.
No, I take your point.
I just like I said, I mean, you probably come across some things you probably still have answers to, but you might not ever get the answers to just because whether it's not disclosed or not. But I mean, documents being destroyed. Like I said in the beginning, people say that's conspiracy talk when someone says destroying a document. I'm like, I mean, you don't want that getting into the hands of anybody else who's not verified to see that too. I mean, the amount of documents that the government prints is pretty astounding. I mean, it seems like every copy of a document, there's like 4 of them somewhere. Like,
yes. You have to add into the mix not only the forgeries that have been created by mischief makers from overseas, and I mentioned my co-author Oleg Zariev, who was very proud of the KGB's involvement in creating mischief within the Kennedy assassination community. But there are plenty of historians who only report, let's say, take a document and only use half of the document without disclosing the rest of the document. And that's quite common practice, but it has created a huge mythology within the intelligence community. So even some quite sensible intelligence professionals, if they've been reading unreliable books, will come away with believing that if you have an Enigma machine, you can physical possession will enable you to read the traffic of everybody else generating encrypted signals on Enigma machines, or that there will be assertions that FDR knew about Pearl Harbor, that the Japanese were going to attack before it actually happened. There are all these myths within the intelligence community, which then get distorted and presented to the public. So you're right. You have to be very skeptical when somebody presents you with a document, even if they're a historian of note. I would urge you to exercise great caution. And let me remind you that there is a British historian who has written 3 books based on documents that he says that he found in the British National Archives. We now know that he forged those documents, smuggled them into the building, inserted them into files, left them there for 6 months, and then pretended to discover them.
Who is that? Who is it?
His name?
Yeah.
Martin Allen.
Okay. I about to say, because I not only know of one person that I respect documents from, and it's Malcolm Blunt, and he's over there in the UK as well too. But he's an intelligence analyst, and he scrolled through like a bunch of these Kennedy documents. He has a whole filing cabinets, and I'm just lucky that a friend of mine, Bart Camp, is transcribing them online for the public to see. He's taking photos and scanning them in. It's going to take him a very long time. I think he's been at it 7 years, but I mean, they just add perspective to the story. I mean, I like reading Dallas police records, and like I said, I'm interested in the Kennedy assassination topic and just scrolling through a lot of stuff. It's just like, I mean, even when I look at documents today, and I have looked at like Walt Disney documents. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover, Invasion into Hollywood, the Hollywood 10, all the files on Frank Sinatra, Marilyn Monroe, and you're just looking at it like, then you go to the NSA archives, and the NSA is like, we don't trust the FBI. And I'm like, what? And it's just like, I think people think like your government institutions, they all run as like a whole. And I'm like, I'm not saying that they're rogue. I'm just saying that they're all like skeptical of each other. The CIA, I think a main article.
So they should be.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I wrote a book, which was an investigation of 24 authors who had claimed to have operated behind enemy lines as agents during the Second World War. So these were clandestine operations that they claimed that they had participated in, and every single one of them had written a book that had been published. They were all fake. Every single one was fake.
Yeah, that pisses me
off. And
I
exposed them. I exposed the photographs that they had contrived. And that was a book called Counterfeit Spies. To my amazement, I discovered there were a similar number of books that had been written in the Cold War era by people who said they had operated for the CIA as assassins around the world, that they had infiltrated narcotic cartels and so on for the FBI, all fake. Another 25 authors that have faked their own stories, and publishers have believed it. It not only publishers, film directors. Did you ever see a movie called Munich? About this was following the massacre of Israeli athletes in the Munich Olympics, but Mossad had undertaken an operation to identify the terrorists involved in the atrocity, hunt them down and assassinate them. This became a successful book and then a movie. It just simply wasn't true. There was the atrocity at Munich, and there was a Mossad operation, but it wasn't in the way described by the person who wrote the book. That's just another example of myths being created within the intelligence community. Take great care in what you read.
It's it's a little difficult sometimes too, especially the Kennedy topics, a much older one, and your young eyes kind of looking in. I know some people I can trust, and I've looked through. I trust documents from Harold Weisberg and Malcolm Blunt, mostly because they're just documents. These people don't have any incentive. They don't want to write a book. They don't want to do anything like that. But I've come across plenty of people that'll be like, spoke to the guy on his dying day and happened to be this second eight. It was just like a bunch of stuff where it's like, obviously that doesn't seem real. There's no logical, like it just seems like a bunch. And then you find out that person's doing it to sell a book. And that's when it becomes difficult. But when I looked over, a lot of your stuff about, even though we barely talked about Guy at all, but I mean, you did plenty of work in the intelligence, especially when you talk about just the number of books you've written on the Cold War and intelligence operations and the involvement. And I trusted your work on it, and it was a pleasure being able to speak with you about it too, man. Like I said, I'm trying my hardest to understand history, and you start understanding that it goes very, very deep, and it goes very, very quick. But Mr. West, I seriously appreciate the time you've given me to be able to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find your books? Do you have a Twitter handle? Any, or just your website?
Website is nigelwest.com.
And that's where we'll find all your books.
Yep, they're all there.
All right. Well, I'm going to link it in the description. Seriously, man, you're welcome back on my show anytime. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.